My name is Karin Kettenring, and I'm the head of the Wetland Ecology and Restoration Lab at Utah State University. And I'm also joined by Annie Henry, who is a research scientist in the Wetland Ecology and Restoration Lab. So she is going to be speaking today along with me. And then we have Anna McIntyre, who's the managing director of the Janet Quinney Lawson Institute for Land, Water, and Air at Utah State University, and she will be helping facilitate the discussion at the end here. So the plan today is we're going to give a seminar to summarize some of these results from our survey, and then we will have everybody introduce themselves. And I know that a number of you were interested in sharing your experiences yourselves, and then we have some additional discussion questions that kind of wrap this up at the end. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to jump right into the presentation. You can hopefully all see my slide. Is everything looking good on your end? Okay. And then Annie, I'm just going to mute you. There we go. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm the head of the Wetland Ecology and Restoration Lab at USU. Our mission is really to better understand wetlands and the plants within them, both native and invasive, to inform and improve both wetland management and restoration. So we're a research-focused lab, but that's really where our focus is. So part of our efforts include these dual surveys that we conducted in 2023 with the interest of improving wetland revegetation. So we really appreciate that you all participated in this survey. So today we're going to summarize the results of our survey. Obviously, you know your practices and the challenges that you face, but we think there's some value for understanding, where you stand relative to other people and whether your situation is similar or different from your colleagues. And also, we really want to formalize this knowledge base to be able to share with other people. So that's part of our intention here, and to help educate others beyond our circles and to find opportunities for improvement and collaboration. So that's some of the motivation for the surveys that we were doing, and to really open up further lines of communication going forward, because I think within this vast group that we surveyed, there's some really motivated people here that want to connect with others, make changes, and collaborate going forward. So at the end of today's presentation, we'll have opportunities for discussion to that effect. Okay, so jumping straight in here, as you all know, revegetation is seeding and planting in wetlands. Vegetation is an essential component of wetlands, supporting all the things that wetlands do, their functions and services. And revegetation, specifically reintroducing plants, is an important aspect of wetland restoration. However, revegetation in wetlands has been historically undervalued, understudied, and, in my opinion, underrepresented compared to other ecosystems. And that's really backed up by what's in the literature of the restoration literature that, the universe that I operate in. So this is just one example of a study that looked at revegetation in a variety of different ecosystems. You've got the number of studies here, the number of experiments, and then who was using seeds, who was using seedlings, cuttings, and rhizomes. But anyway, you can see in the orange line here where wetlands are, and there are many fewer studies out there with respect to revegetation in wetlands relative to grasslands and forests. So terrestrial ecosystems have just really been the focus going forward. So that was part of our motivation here. And we also know, I think you fundamentally understand that increasing knowledge about revegetation doesn't necessarily mean that you can go out and revegetate, because there are so many other barriers that people face, and that's part of what we wanted to document. What are the challenges that people are having? Are they similar or different across the region? In addition to that, we really, again, want to document how widely revegetation is actually practiced, what are the approaches that people are using, and what are the challenges that people are facing. And then related to this, we know that one vital aspect of revegetation is that the plant materials need to be available and accessible. So we wanted to survey the native plant industry. We're going to largely use the term vendor today, but we are referring to people that are producing and selling and distributing seeds and plants. So the native plant industry is relatively well developed, again, for terrestrial ecosystems. But what about for wetlands? That's what we wanted to know for this Intermountain West region. And we wanted to know, what are vendor practices, what's the state of species availability, and what challenges do vendors face? And obviously, those of you working in this industry know these well, but again, we think formalizing this information and being able to share those challenges in particular mean that there may be some unique opportunities going forward. So we're really curious about asking these questions. We also are focusing on the Intermountain West in particular as our study region. And that is, well, one, we obviously here at Utah State sit squarely within the Intermountain West region. We're located right up here. And all of you know probably that the semi-arid region is typically quite dry, and as a result, wetlands are naturally scarce and provide essential habitat because there are even fewer wetlands out there. And some of the major threats that I'm sure you've all been hearing about, what's happening with Great Salt Lake and its declining elevation. Water shortages really plague people across the region, and as well as invasive species, both invasive animals. Our DWR crew here was just out treating for invasive carp today. We, in particular, here in northern Utah, are dealing with invasive Phragmites, but there are quite a few other species that really challenge and actually motivate revegetation after invasive species management. So our project goals then were to, with the manager survey, determine managers' revegetation practices and challenges. Similarly, for the vendor survey, determine vendors' practices and challenges. And ultimately, our goal is really to look for synergies as well as some discrepancies between these different groups and opportunities for communication and collaboration. So I'm going to present now on the manager survey, and then Annie will talk about the vendor survey. So the manager survey was an online survey with quite a few multiple choice questions and text entry questions. It took about 30 minutes for people to complete. And the respondent pool were the people that we actually sent the survey to were people that directly managed wetland habitat on federal and state land in our region. We particularly focused on agency people because we knew that we could better identify who they were just through public records, as opposed to focusing on private landowners for this particular survey. It made it more tractable for us to do that. So we sent the survey to 360 federal and state managers working in the Intermountain West. And in turn, we got back 52 surveys, which to me is really a great response, just because I know how incredibly busy so many people are. And you can see also that we had a nice spread of managers responding. Each of those numbers represents the number of people that responded in each of those states. So let me talk about what that pool of respondents looked like. Generally, people had small staff, 3 to 5 full-time, 3 to 5 part-time staff members. And most of these wetland managers managed vast upland areas, and then the wetland areas that they managed varied greatly in size, from as small as 1 kilometer up to 500 kilometers squared. So really a wide range of land management responsibilities in terms of wetlands. We asked about about people's budgets and how much of their budgets were specific to revegetation. So this graph here is going to be similar to what most of the data we're going to show today are. And so we'll always have on the y-axis here the percent of respondents. So basically, if you see a tall bar in our graph, that means most people chose that option. And so in this case, when we asked how much of your budget is allocated to revegetation, most people were saying it's 1 to 25% of their budgets. So revegetation was a small fraction of their budgets, and in some cases there was for 6 people, basically none of their budget was dedicated to revegetation, even though they were doing revegetation. One thing I forgot to mention, that so the bars represent the percent of respondents. The numbers in the bars are just the number of people. So here it's 34 people, here it's 6 people, and so forth. Anyway, that pattern will be helpful as I show a number of these graphs here. Then we asked, okay, of your budgets dedicated to revegetation, how much of it is dedicated to monitoring? And in this case, similarly, a pretty small percentage of revegetation budgets were dedicated to monitoring, to seeing how the revegetation efforts actually worked. So, and 10 respondents said that basically none of their budgets were allocated to monitoring. So this is kind of interesting because when we asked folks what they used to plan the revegetation efforts, monitoring was actually the most important factor. So we've got monitoring, annual plans, habitat management plans, revegetation plans, what's helping inform people's revegetation activities. So despite the fact that people have small budgets or essentially little budget for monitoring, it's one of the primary ways that managers plan their wetland revegetation activities. So I think that's really challenging. You know, people are stretched thin in terms of their budgets, but they're still using this information to plan accordingly. We asked what are people's motivations for revegetation, particularly for planting or mats on the left-hand side and for seeding on the right-hand side. And you can see these different motivations. One thing that was really interesting to me when looking at these top motivations, erosion control was actually usually the most common reason people were revegetating. And sure, almost as popular was revegetation in the context of invasive species management, as well as for habitat. No surprise there. Another one that actually was a little bit surprising to me was how many people were revegetating for water quality improvement. I thought that was pretty interesting. Okay, now what types of habitats are people revegetating? So we asked people about whether they're revegetating submergent wetlands, meadow, emergent, playa wetlands, as well as riparian wetlands. So some visuals here on the right-hand side, and then you can see those different habitats on the x-axis here. Okay, this graph is a little bit complicated, but I'm going to walk you through it. Basically, those numbers, those darker green numbers, mean that people were revegetating more of those habitats. So if somebody responded with this, that they were revegetating 76 to 100% of their riparian habitat, you can see that here. So most of the time, most people are not revegetating all of their riparian habitat, all of their meadow or emergent habitat. Most of the time, they're doing more like 1 to 25% of the riparian habitat, or 1 to 25% of the emergent or meadow habitat. So we see modest percentages of riparian and emergent meadow habitats being revegetated. And of course, that makes sense. It's logistically impossible to be trying to revegetate 100% of your habitat each year, or over the last 5 years in the case of this question. But there were quite a few people that were focused on revegetation in that riparian and emergent habitat. When we asked the same question with respect to submergent species, submergent habitat, and mudflat or playa habitats, as shown here, most people were not revegetating those habitats at all. So 22 people said they were not revegetating their submergent habitat. That was, these are really important aquatic species, but we know that this is just not as commonly practiced, and there's just not well-developed protocols too, which is probably part of the issue. It's not too surprising that people don't do a lot of revegetation in mudflat or playa habitats, because these are partially unvegetated habitats anyway, so it's, maybe the need for revegetation is less there. So within these habitat types, riparian, emergent meadow, playa, and submergent, we asked what particular species people were interested in reintroducing as part of their revegetation efforts. And so looking at riparian and emergent, you can see that there was a lot of interest in, there's a lot of interest in riparian revegetation, and it's a variety of species, willows and cottonwoods, and just general native riparian species is that middle bar here. And then in terms of the species that people are interested in terms of emergent meadow species, just a general interest in native species to these habitats, rushes, perennial grasses, sedges, and so forth. And then we've got a list of specific species that may be of interest to folks. Generally, in terms of playa and submergent habitat, this reflects that previous slide here, that there's less interest in reintroducing native playa species and native playa species as well as native submergent species. So these species of interest reflect those habitat types that people are revegetating from that previous slide. Also, we did ask specifically about people's interest in seeds and plugs and plants and mats across these different habitat types. You know, we weren't sure if there would be a focus on seeds for one habitat type and a focus on plants for a different habitat type, but that was generally not the case. There was broad interest in all of these different approaches to revegetation. We wanted to know what were people's priorities when buying plant materials and how they basically chose what they were going to buy. So we looked at, we asked people how important are these different factors that you can see on the x-axis here. And the darker the green color, the more important that factor is. So in this particular case here, the most important factor that people chose was plant species suitability to a site. So people want to get species that are going to work at their site. That makes sense. It was interesting to see too that choosing native species was very important to a lot of people. Obviously, people are going to be choosing species and sources that are available from native plant vendors. And let me actually just highlight these. Other things that I was surprised at how many people were interested in buying seed that was certified, because I don't think I haven't heard as much of a discussion about that. Another thing that was really important was that seed lot that people are buying is viable. Again, that means it's usable. And then of course, price is important, but it wasn't as important as some of those other factors. So that was kind of interesting to me as well. We also wanted to know if people were able to get the plants here in this top graph and the seeds that they want for revegetation. And for most cases, people were able to get all of the plants and all of the seeds that they wanted, but that wasn't always the case. In other situations, people were able to get some of the plants and seeds that they wanted, but they were helped by the fact that a lot of people were flexible in their needs, both in terms of their seeds and their plants. So that flexibility pays off, of course, when if not everything you want is available. I think this graph here is maybe some of our most important finding, this and the next slide. And I find this, it confirms a lot of what we know, but also maybe some new insights here. So we asked people about the challenges that they make with respect to challenges that they face with respect to both environmental factors on the left-hand side and capacity-related factors on the right-hand side. And the biggest challenges that people face in terms of environmental factors are drought and climate change, invasive plants, and water availability. There are a number of other things there, such as excess nutrients and sediment and salinity, wildfires, heavy metals. Those are other challenges that were identified as important, but by fewer people. In terms of capacity related challenges, you all are living this, that budget limitations, having not enough personnel, and logistics were really the biggest challenges in terms of capacity. But there are a number of other things too, like site preparation, equipment required, access to the plant materials that people want, and so forth, that challenged the ability of people to do revegetation. What do managers need to overcome their challenges? This is what we heard from folks. The resource, this really directly ties to that previous slide, but resources, more funding, more staff. Having additional funding was the most important factor that people identified. I thought it was also interesting that outreach and extension documents, information about revegetation was identified as something that would be really helpful to people. As a researcher and somebody that actually produces things like this, or some of my colleagues do here at our land grant institution, this tells me that this is information that could be useful to folks, particularly related to revegetation. Also, communication with other practitioners, restoration practitioners, as well as researchers was identified as really important. Having more paid staff, potentially regional conferences or workshops, guides that vendors provide when they're selling seeds and plants were also identified as important factors. So these are things that we're hoping to hear, maybe from individuals too, about what do you need going forward and what are opportunities in terms of lines of communication or increasing coordination and knowledge. We did ask folks how much collaboration they have with the vendors that are supplying native plant material suppliers. A little less than 50% of managers are actively communicating and collaborating with native plant vendors, and fewer are collaborating with research institutions, but quite a few actually do not have collaborations with vendors or research institutions, which I think maybe highlights an opportunity for, again, increased communication and collaboration. So some take-home points here. Budgets are limited for wetland revegetation, and the monitoring part of those budgets are particularly limited, even though monitoring is an important tool for planning future revegetation efforts. Managers are revegetating for important ecosystem services. Erosion control was the top of those, but invasive species control, habitat, water quality improvement. But their folks are limited by lack of funds and personnel and quite a few logistical challenges. Access to diverse wetland plant materials is a concern. Managers are often not able to find the species that they would like to use, but quite a few have flexible needs and adapt to what is available. Drought and climate change are the biggest environmental challenges that managers are facing, followed by invasive plants and water availability. And helping to address that is increasing financial and human resources, particularly for monitoring, increased information and collaborations to continue and expand wetland revegetation efforts. So that is a synopsis of our manager survey. I'm going to stop my screen sharing here, and Annie is going to tell us about the vendor survey now, and I will mute myself and give control over to you.
Great, thanks, Karin. Just one quick second here. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. So like Karin said, I'm gonna switch us over to the vendor survey. See if I can, okay, great. This was also an online survey that some of you took, and it also had a bunch of multiple choice and text entry questions, and took about a half an hour to complete. For this survey, we sent the survey out to vendors, so who we considered native seed and plant suppliers and growers, who provide plant materials for wetland and riparian restoration within that same Intermountain West region. And we sent this survey to 134 plant material vendors who we did kind of have to dig for and identify individually. So it's a lower number. And we did end up with a more modest sample size of 29, but as you can see there, the pretty decent spread still. And these were mostly small organizations as well, so less than 5 or 5 to 15 full and part-time staff, and they were mostly private organizations. And this covered an array of different types of plant material collection and distribution. So people who participated were selling plants, growing plants, selling seeds, collecting, producing seeds, among some other roles there. Okay, So this figure, so same as with the manager survey, it's always going to be percent of respondents here on the y-axis. And this one shows for each species group how many species vendors offer in an average year over the last 5 years. So down here on the x-axis is the number of species offered. So for example, aquatic species, quite limited. What we're looking at here is that 13 vendors reported offering no aquatic species, and 6 vendors reported offering 1 to 4 aquatic species, and then only 2 reported offering 5 to 15. And this is interesting because we also found that about 40% of land managers were revegetating aquatic ecosystems. So there's a big discrepancy there. Now for emergent and meadow, we're starting to get into a few more species offered, but still pretty limited. So here, 2 vendors are now offering 16 to 26 for emergent and 9 offering 5 to 15. And then over on the meadow habitat type side of things, we have 5 vendors offering 16 to 26 and 11 offering 5 to 15. So for riparian, we see a higher number of offerings, but it's still pretty modest. But we do get up to 7 vendors offering more than 26 species. So there's a lot of really good reasons why these offerings are pretty limited, and we'll get into more of those later. But also this diversity reflects the sales that vendors have. So 75% of vendors reported that they have substantial portions of their sales coming from terrestrial and riparian species, while way fewer said the same thing about aquatic and emergent and meadow. In fact, only 3% said that aquatic species are a substantial portion of their sales. So this represents a pretty small fraction of the whole pool of potential wetland species for the arid West, which is around 1,650. So in general, we just found that the actual species available for restoration is pretty limited, and likely mostly confined to workhorse species, those that are relatively easy to actually propagate and reliably purchased. And then just for a little perspective of what's going on in the broader scale, nationally, about 26% of the 25,000 vascular plants that are native to the US are sold commercially. And then in grasslands, which, as you saw before in Karin's slide, has a long history of research and practice in terms of restoration and revegetation, 74% of the 1,000 possible species are available. So then we also looked at the actual plant material types that are available. So here we have plant materials on the x-axis, like the sod mats, cuttings, bare rootstock, plugs, containerized plants, and seeds. And you can see there's a pretty good spread across species types and habitat types. And in particular, there's lots of seeds available, which is great for large-scale, high-diversity restoration. So, for example, this is showing that 10 vendors are offering grass seeds, 8 are offering seeds of bulrush, etc. So there is potentially a little bit low in terms of the sod mats that are available compared to what managers might be wanting, but overall, it's a great spread. So we also asked vendors if there were any species or species types that they have been, customers have requested that they've been unable to supply over the past 5 years. And this might seem pretty obvious, but it's pretty common for vendors to be unable to supply a species that's requested. So there were 18 responses that said yes. And vendors also said that customers usually request a certain species rather than any species based on an attribute, like for a specific ecosystem service or a project goal. And then, like you saw before, this is sort of countered by the fact that even though they're asking for certain species, managers are often flexible with what they are going to use and can just use what's available. Now, in narrative responses, so people wrote in comments regarding this question. A lot of people said that unrealistic lead times and fluctuations in demand contributed to their inability to supply species. So then on the flip side of that, vendors told us about whether they have produced more wetland species in a given year over the past 5 years. And you can see it's much less common, but it also does happen. And we found that 7 of the 8 people who reported having oversupplies actually said it was due to insufficient demand rather than species doing better than they had expected. And one thing that was super interesting was that some of the species that some vendors said that they were unable to supply were also at times the same species that other vendors said they had an oversupply of. This was happening with rushes and sedges in particular. Okay, so similar to on the manager side of things, like understanding and sort of formalizing our understanding of the challenges of production and sales is super important. So we found that the most common selected challenges that vendors are facing are market fluctuations, lack of personnel and time, climate and water, and funding and budgets. There's also some other but slightly less common challenges, but also still super important, such as access to equipment or facilities, technical knowledge relating to species or species types, technical knowledge related to production, and access to water. Now, speaking to this market fluctuation finding, we also found that a lot of vendors have very few custom grow orders. So this is showing that for 62% of vendors, they have less than 25% of their sales coming from custom grow orders. So that's a big contributor to that market fluctuations piece. When we asked what vendors need to overcome challenges, we found that the biggest one was financial incentives to make new or difficult species worthwhile to put the effort into producing. They need clear guidance from customers on what species will best meet the customer's restoration goals. And then also, interestingly, a lot of vendors wanted and needed feedback from customers on the actual field outcomes of the plant materials they provide. So how successful are those plant materials in establishing in different situations? Some also selected that they said that they needed better training for personnel on species ID and propagation, more research into difficult to produce species, and better access to information. And then there was a smattering of other things that were written in, such as plant resources for starter seed and access to land, increased funding, and increased use of contracts. Okay, so we also asked how vendors determine what to offer. And we found that mostly vendors are using their knowledge of the industry, as well as ease of collection and propagation and informal discussions. And then very few are using contracts and custom grow orders to plan what to offer, which makes sense because we just saw that a lot of them don't have those or don't have very many of those. We were also curious about how vendors tend to obtain new information when they have a lack of knowledge about how to produce something. And we found that there's a whole bunch of different things being used, which is great. And we found it really interesting that a lot of vendors are accessing peer-reviewed literature, which is not the case in a lot of circumstances. So that's pretty cool. Back up. But also vendors are doing in-house testing. They're accessing non-academic literature. talking to colleagues, attending conferences and workshops, and some just said they're doing the best with the knowledge they have, and a few also contact extension faculty. Now, the barriers to doing these things and getting this knowledge were spread pretty evenly across time for in-house experiments, time to read literature, and time to attend conferences. So overall, there's not enough time. Some also said that access to literature was a barrier. So we also asked vendors to write in responses to the question, what are the most important factors to ensure the long-term success of vendors? And some of the themes that came out of that in order of most reported were the use of contracts and creating consistency in demand, communication and collaboration with customers, but also with policymakers and academic researchers, resources in the form of funding for seeds, as well as personnel and time. And then support for small businesses, so helping small businesses connect with clients. And then finally, public education on what species to use, but also more generally raising awareness of the value of native plant communities. So for the vendor survey, some take-home points. Overall, there's a limited availability of aquatic, emergent, and meadow species compared to riparian and terrestrial. To improve the availability of wetland species, vendors really need some financial incentives to produce risky species, more feedback from managers on what to produce, and feedback on field outcomes. Market fluctuations were the biggest challenge that vendors face, and consistent demand through the use of contracts and government interventions could help address this concern. And vendors also need realistic lead times to produce specific materials that customers request. And then lastly, to obtain information to propagate new species, vendors do a lot of different things, including accessing peer review literature, conducting in-house experiments, reading technical documents, consulting colleagues, and going to conferences. And the main barrier they have in doing those things is that there's just not enough time. So now I'm going to take just a few minutes to sort of synthesize our findings from these two surveys, starting with the supply and demand aspect of things. So we found that managers really need diverse plant species to revegetate for these important ecosystem services, and access to those materials is a concern for some and many. However, vendors have a hard time producing diverse species because they're risky and people might not buy them. And vendors are generally more able to produce workhorse species that are reliable to produce and get purchased. Increasing the use of contracts with sufficient lead time to produce those desired species would give vendors some security and also ensure that managers would have the species that they want. However, the flip side of that is that contracts with large lead times can be really difficult for managers to enter into because of funding sources and agency planning timelines. So this is sort of a standing question that arose from the survey of how to smooth out these supply and demand challenges. Next, in terms of capacity, we found that everybody across the board has capacity challenges. In terms of personnel, both groups are short-staffed, and this for vendors limits their ability to obtain new information to propagate new species. And for managers, it really is limiting to their ability to do monitoring. And sufficient and consistent funding would be super helpful in alleviating that problem. Now, in terms of funding, for vendors, financial assistance to share the risk of propagating new species would really help in this effort to increase species diversity, and contracts would reduce the risks that the plants that they actually put that effort into won't be purchased. Funding for monitoring would help managers both plan restorations, but also adjust their plans as needed. And it would also, increased monitoring would also allow them to be able to give that feedback that managers said they could use on how plants do in the field. So this is another standing question of how to address these ongoing funding challenges. Another thing that came out of both surveys was the desire for increased collaboration. And that can be in the form of institutional support. So both groups could use the state and federal agencies recognize the importance of wetland revegetation with diverse plant materials and also provide financial support for that. Regional partnerships are a kind of collaboration that has the potential to do a whole bunch of things, including facilitating that communication in terms of research needs, plant material needs and availability, field outcomes, connecting growers with plant material users, organizing volunteers, finding funding, etc. And then also increased collaboration with research institutions is an opportunity to develop new knowledge that's really relevant for those groups on propagation methods for new species, restoration protocols and climate adaptations. And then we just also found that it's important that those findings get published in a way that those groups can actually access the findings. And then lastly, the solution to some of these challenges is simply greater communication and collaboration between these two groups, so vendors and managers, which is why we're super excited to have a discussion about these things. And then before I close, I just wanted to mention that both of these surveys are in the process of being published in Restoration Ecology, the vendor one like tomorrow and the manager one soon, hopefully. And we are planning on sending a PDF out to everyone of those papers once they're out. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Karen.
Thank you, Annie. So we're going to transition now into, we want to have a discussion with this group that's here today. We really appreciate your participation in the surveys and your interest in participating today. And a handful of you were interested in sharing your thoughts firsthand. And so if you feel comfortable putting your cameras on, feel free to do that. But I'm going to specifically call on the people that said that were interested in speaking. And then for those of you that maybe were not necessarily interested in speaking, but you might want to just introduce yourself and where you are, feel free to do that as part of the discussion. And then we have a handful of questions that we think will help spur the discussion a little bit more here. So first, we're going to hear from Keith Hambrecht, who is from Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, State Lands, and he has some thoughts to share. And then after that, I'm going to call on Jeff Klausman from North Fork Native Plants. So Keith, you are up.
Hi, everyone. So I manage state lands for Utah, specifically sovereign lands, which are the beds of Bear Lake, Bear River, Great Salt Lake, Jordan River, Utah Lake, and sections of the Green and Colorado River. So we have 2,200 miles of shoreline, wetland, and riparian habitat. And our program is relatively young, and mostly our focus has been dealing with a lot of invasive species. So on our rivers, Russian olive tamarisk, and then in our wetlands, invasive Phragmites. I found this survey to be quite helpful, and I'm actually feeling really optimistic right now with all of this stuff. So, like looking at the challenges that we're all facing. So now with the concern over Great Salt Lake hitting record lows, we have received a huge boost in funding, and we have a lot of ongoing funding. So now we need to put that to use. Additionally, we've made some really good headway with a lot of our invasive species removal efforts. So we're kind of in a lot of areas turning the corner, I think, where we're ready to start revegetating. And so now knowing that contracts are really important, I think we're ready to do that. We have ongoing funding, so let's set up some contracts so that vendors can have reliability and we can have this source. Additionally, we're in a wet period now. So for many years, it was bone dry in our wetlands where we're like, we can't get anything to grow. So we've got water, we have funding, ongoing funding, and we've made some headway removing our invasive species. I think we're ready to turn a corner. The biggest question mark for me still is, I think, some of the species specific challenges and knowledge. So I think a lot of our coordinators are probably in a position where if they heard from researchers, you should be using these species, and we felt confident to pursue that, then we would go talk to the vendors and say, hey, this is what we want. And we feel confident in doing that because there's research backing it. I think I'm just curious in general too, of like if the funding thing has changed for other managers recently. There was the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, all of this federal funding coming in. I think some of the conferences I've been to more recently have been about there's a flood of money. So I wonder if that's changing for other people as well, which could be great news for all of us. So yeah, those are my initial thoughts and feedback for now.
Yeah, that's great, Keith. I'm going to make notes of a couple of these questions that are coming up that we can maybe address to the whole group as part of this. But we'll keep doing some introductions here. Jeff, do you want to unmute and talk about your company, North Fork Native Plants, and your experiences?
Sure. Thanks, Karen, and Annie. That great presentation. Appreciate being included. We come at this from an angle where we work on both sides as both a vendor and a manager. On the management side, we manage a lot of private property and conservation easement property for wildlife. A lot of that is wetland and riparian habitat. And then, of course, we also have our native plant nursery, which really started in developing wetland plant materials. When the presentations were going, I jotted down a few things that I just wanted to share to spark other people's comments. I'm interested in those. I think we still have quite a few gaps to try to address. From the sort of diversity of plant materials aspect, I think there's a real lack of supply in wetland forbs. And that's probably driven by demand and some of the problems that were highlighted for vendors. I think there are still quite a few knowledge gaps when we move into the submerged aquatic communities, both on just basic biology and certainly restoration ecology. I think there's a pretty major ecological gap in our profession with seed and plant movement guidelines. What's appropriate. We hear a lot about this for xeric species and some of those communities, but you don't see a lot in the literature. I haven't looked at it in the last maybe couple of years, but when I used to follow that more carefully, it's hard to find guidance there. So I'd love to see that gap closed. And then I think there's a real paucity of people interested in just general botany. It's hard to find a good botanist. I think that's a challenge for a lot of the managers. They don't know what to plant. I mean, a lot of times they don't entirely understand what they have in their managed habitats, and it's hard to find qualified people to do accurate inventories. And so oftentimes they will be selecting plants based on a catalog or basic traits from an NRCS document and maybe not putting the most appropriate communities back together. So I think that's a real challenge. But those were my original thoughts. Kind of leave it at that for now, and I'm curious to hear when we have a free form discussion what other people think about some of those points.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, let's hear from the DWR managers. I don't know, we've got Rich and Chad and David who all said they were interested in speaking, and they're all on the same phone. So maybe you can kind of tag team it, and then after that, Jim Brown, I'll call on you, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Okay, so I want to address submerged aquatic vegetation, and the last 3 days we've been doing carp control at Farmington Bay, and really we've done more for wildlife in these 3 days than we can do for the rest of the entire year by killing. I don't know if you can see these in the background, but we've killed tens of thousands of carp. And as far as the wetlands along the Great Salt Lake, we've got such a great source of sago already. If we can eliminate carp and reduce turbidity, we get great sago. So, our main focus is on getting emergent vegetation. And one of the challenges I want to talk about have to do with sod mats. We love North Fork and worked with Becca. I think we got the last 25 hard stem bulrush mats for the year. But one of the things that we need to do with the vendors and I think our purchasing agents is to figure out how we can get a big grow. Because right now, the way that our purchasing guidelines are is we can't pay anything until we receive the product. So we all realize that there's an upfront cost with that. But I guess, we'd like to work with the vendors and our purchasing agents so we can figure out how to do all that. That's one of my big concerns, because you can see behind me here on the Turpin Dike where we have sod mats. We planted these like in 2014. They are amazing at erosion control. And where we didn't plant sod mats, we get so much erosion. So I really want to plant a lot more sod mats on my areas. So I really would like to continue that conversation with anybody that is in the sod mat business. So I'll give it to Chad.
Yeah, thanks. My name's Chad Cranny. I'm a wetland manager for the Division of Wildlife. Work a lot with teeth and invasive species removal, particularly Phragmites. So that's where a lot of our revegetations come in, but also mainly that and erosion control. But it's I'm glad these surveys really brought out what the real problem is. I think on both ends is just having the plants available at the right time and our restrictions with our funding and stuff. And it's funny because just yesterday, all three of us were talking about we need to get some contracts out so we can have vendors will know what we need for the next 5 years, and we will know that we're going to get it. So I guess one question I would have for vendors is like, how long term of a contract are we talking about? What would be useful for you all? And then I'll hand it over to David England.
Hello, everyone. My name is David England. I manage Farmington Bay and Tempe Springs. And honestly, we've hit a lot of stuff that I've had concerns with, but just something else to kind of throw out is I think something that we can do better on, and that's collaborating with the other vendors and other folks that are doing restoration in wetlands. I mean, Keith already mentioned we're kind of in the infancy of doing a lot of this seeding restoration out here, and we're still a lot of gaps with what's working, what's not working. So I think collaborating with others is something that's much needed.
Great. Really appreciate all those insights. They definitely resonate with what we were hearing from the broader population that we surveyed. So let's hear from Jim Brown. He's north of Seattle, and would love to hear some of your thoughts and initial reflections.
Sure. Thanks a lot. It was good to hear some of the responses from the other vendors. in that they also have a hard time getting any kind of contracting going. That's kind of our big concern. We're a bare root nursery. We're 60 acres bare root production. We mainly do the woodies. WACD, Washington Association of Conservation Districts, took on running this facility back in '93, knowing that a number of salmon runs were going to be listed as threatened and endangered. And one of the big things that needed to happen was improving riparian habitat along this salmon-bearing streams. So our focus has been and still is on riparian species. We also do upland, and we do a lot of willows and cottonwoods, so we get down into some of the wetter grounds. But mainly for us, it's riparian, and we're hearing a lot of stuff about here in Washington State of addressing the problem of temperature polluted bodies of water. So we've been working with the State Conservation Commission here and trying to develop programs where they could forward contract, because you really do need 2 or 3 years lead time to develop a contract, go through seed acquisition, production, shipping. And there's basically a state policy that they can't pay for anything that they're not going to receive in the next 2 years, which cuts the timeline pretty short or not long enough, depending on if it's a 1-year crop or a 2-year product. So with the kind of increase in production that we're hearing about, we would definitely need some assurity on that. We hear a lot of chatter out there about programs ramping up, and in the past we've speculatively gone after that, and 90% of our production are more speculative. But we've speculatively gone after that potential market, which sometimes evaporates by the time you have plants ready. And this year would be a good example of that. There's kind of a little lag in funding on projects this year. So while we have been ramping up more and more every year, we've actually seen our sales drop this year. And the sad part of that is not only financial, but we're going to have a lot of plants that are not going to find a home. The State Conservation Commission has come up with some grant funding for salmon habitat improvement. So it sounds like there's going to be an increase in demand for next year, and we're certainly in the process of gearing up for that. We're planning more and more of everything, but it's pretty apprehensive on our part, not knowing what's going to happen. Yeah. So I think to help the vendors, need to be some form of forward contracting, or reduce some form of concrete understanding that any additional plant stock produced will find a home. Now, with the Conservation Commission, they funded a riparian plant propagation program, and we signed up for that. We got a contract for that. Initially, they were talking about millions of plants being needed. In the end, we got 17,000. So I'm not sure where that disconnect was. They were able to provide an opportunity to bill for production costs during the course of it. They couldn't do a deposit, but we were fine with that. But then they needed all this documentation that the bare root nursery really couldn't do. So we were okay with that, just as long as there's a guaranteed sale at the end. But I think you guys are doing a great job here and trying to bring together vendors and managers. We have a conference we're going to go down to in Seattle at the Center for Urban Horticulture on the 2nd of April. It'll be a similar type of thing, more Washington State related. So we're glad to see this conversation opening up, because so often we're grasping whatever little bit of information we can gather from the managers. trying to do what I'm doing now is highlight where we're coming from.
Yeah, I
Let's-
really appreciate that, your thoughts, Jim. I think one of the things that just really struck me from the survey was how the financial risks and the market fluctuations that you all face. I mean, that is, as it seems almost insurmountable at times, and really underscores the need for the need for you to have more contracts, have more planning, know what people want, and yet at the same time, I think your customers really struggle with being able to provide those contracts or sign contracts because of regulations they face within their particular institutions. So I don't know if Josh or Isaac or Katie or Derek want to introduce themselves. If you do, feel free to unmute. Oh, okay. Derek, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. I'm Derek Shook. I'm a hydrologist with the National Park Service's Water Resources Division. We're based in Fort Collins, Colorado, but we work with parks, support national parks all over the country. From time to time, we do wetland restorations, and I guess I'd say that one of the big obstacles actually has been finding vendors sometimes. I was surprised and impressed to hear 128 that you guys identified. We've only worked with a few that I know of, including Jeff, which has been which has gone very well. And one thing that Jeff mentioned was the ecological significance of different genotypes or subspecies, kind of that site level fidelity and adaptation to the plants. That's something that we in the Park Service are very interested in, having local seed sources and local genotypes. Oftentimes that means collecting seeds from our sites or very nearby, and on a contract basis, having a nursery grow them out. But it's different for every park. But one thing that I would identify is having some good guidance from nurseries on how to do this, because lots of times we don't have anyone who's a wetland specialist at all. Hopefully a plant person in a park, but it's highly variable. And so I think that kind of figuring out how to connect, I don't know if like a list of vendors and what they offer would be appropriate, but something like that, especially because it can take a long time to collect seeds and have them custom grown out. So if there are kind of local genotypes that are already available on a commercial basis, that would be helpful for a park to know that that seed source is from nearby.
Yeah, that's really that. As soon as you said that in the beginning, I thought, oh, we could share the vendor information with people. It's publicly available information, and Annie largely compiled that database, and it was a lot of work and a lot of phone calls to try to, you don't know who's out there, and half the battle is just trying to make those connections. So I really appreciate that. Could you, if you're willing to entertain one more question, could you talk about what your contracting abilities are? Like your ability to plan and maybe have a contract with native plant vendors, suppliers?
Yeah, I think it's kind of, I guess, I don't know the whole spectrum of contracting abilities, but I think it's pretty good and kind of standard for us. We often in the National Park Service operate slowly, plan things over a few years and implement over a few years. It's nice reassurance knowing that we'll still kind of have the same lands and mandates for management, guidance for management on those lands through time. So, of course, we have to identify and often cobble together funding sources, but I do think contracting has worked well for us, partly because it's really a pretty deliberate process with a lot of people are being very careful in what they introduce into national parks. So anyway, that's my kind of
Yeah.
limited perspective on it.
That's interesting. And are you seeing increasing funding for restoration projects from federal legislation? That was part of
Hugely.
Keith's question.
Yes, we definitely are. We have some, internal capacity issues, as you've identified everyone has, as far as like how we are able to select and distribute that money and then really manage it. Again, there are a lot of people who end up being the point person to say a wetland restoration project who just don't have much experience within those efforts or even sometimes those habitats. And so I think that having that trusting kind of I guess a trusting relationship with the vendor or contractor is huge because it very often happens, through kind of no blame assigned, just that people will deliver whatever service they can to meet the budget that you said you had from the get-go. And I think that sometimes that ends up bringing some fluff and some unnecessary pursuits and maybe just like less than optimal restoration approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm gonna open it up for broader discussion here. And there are a couple more pointed questions I may ask just based on what people have said. But I do want to, also if anybody wants to ask a question of another person, you can maybe, there's both a Q&A option at the bottom where people can, if you've got, maybe there's something from the content in the webinar that you want to follow up on, or if you want to just, there's also the chat function if you want to put a question out to the group. But Jeff, I know you have to go at 11:15, but I wondered if I could ask you a couple more questions about some of the things you said. You mentioned aquatic plants, and I was wondering what kind of demand do you see? Are people inquiring about it? And but maybe not to the extent that it's worth really investing in. I'm talking about submerged species and rooted floating leaf species.
Yeah, I think a lot of that demand, at least for us, is kind of created internally with seeing management challenges on the ground, specifically for wildlife and water birds, and wanting to improve those habitats. And for us, there's unfortunately the barriers are not as obvious. It's not something just like carp. There's certainly invasives that play a role in some of this, passive restoration, but for us, it seems like we have to push a little harder to try to either enhance these communities or, tip the balance one way or the other. So for a while, we were sort of following more just wetland management literature and what the responses are to changing hydrology and hydro period and things like that. And then, but when you try to make the jump to finding products and techniques to jumpstart that stuff, we do a lot of work for trumpeter swan, so that's an incredibly important plant. It's hard to find that information. And so when that's not out there, it's very risky when you go to the production side to get geared up. That's a whole different kind of production setup from growing things, emergent plants or riparian plants or whatever. So that's a definite challenge for sure. And I know that you guys are doing some work in that regard, and I certainly look forward to seeing some of those results.
Yeah.
Maybe they're already out there. I'm not sure, but I know it was ongoing not long ago.
Yeah, it's still an active area of research, but we have had at least one round of initial experiments. This is particularly a master's students project looking at 3 aquatic plant species restoration down on Utah Lake, and there are this I think is highlighting another thing that's really a challenge, is how how to share information readily without overwhelming people. And sometimes it's on a need to know basis, and other times, you know, if you are offered some resources, it maybe is just helpful in the moment. And as one example, we produced an aquatic plant identification guide because we just didn't even, to have capacity to restore species, you have to be able to identify them, back to your point about botanical challenges. And so putting that guide together has ended up being, I think, maybe helped open the eyes of many people, including myself, about how many aquatic species there are out there. And it underscores the point you made earlier about losing diversity. And that actually circles back to another question I wanted to ask you about forb. So you mentioned your concern about losing forb diversity in particular, and I agree about that's a really important point. It's something that we've been having discussions with our manager collaborators with quite a bit, because some of those forb species, not only are they good pollinator and other habitat species, but they tend to, some of them grow quite fast and actually are good for invasion, you know, trying to keep Phragmites and other unwanted species at bay. So I was curious, you mentioned maybe that there, I just wanted to get a little bit more of a sense of what you see with respect to forbs. Is there not at this point a lot of demand for it? Is that what you were saying? And is that
Yeah,
demand
I mean,
increasing at all?
I would think there's, at least on the production side, there's virtually zero demand. And I speculate that the reason there's no demand is because we just don't have a lot of understanding about those plants. The focus has been on these workhorse plants, you know, the grasses, the grass likes. Um, so I think it's daunting for managers to go out and try to even identify and catalog all those other non-grass likes, and then it's building you know, the ecological knowledge of those plants and what sorts of roles they might play. I know that you guys are, you know, in the trenches on some of the most difficult sites with Phragmites and reed canary grass and the whole, you know, the whole gamut. So, having information about even the most common forbs would be handy. And I think if it was out there and you could show the ecological role that those plants play, that would eventually build more on the demand side. And then when the demand builds, the supply will build. But
I just wanted to quickly piggyback off of that because it seemed like a good tie-in. Karin, you wanted to bring up someone wanted to participate but couldn't be here. And they had a really similar point. They wanted to add to the discussion that this is Andrew Coonan at the Nevada Department of Wildlife, who also said that one of the hardest things they have is finding time for professional development and learning opportunities. And that extends to education about planting and vegetation, and knowledge, and finding a knowledgeable supplier as well. So I think that is probably a common experience.
Yeah, I think that I was really struck with Andrew's comment. He actually he was a USU student and then worked here on Great Salt Lake, but now is one of the WMA managers out in Nevada. And maybe both Jim and Jeff might have thoughts on this, but he said one of his challenges is finding suppliers that are familiar with his specific climate and environmental conditions. And, you know, there's such a vast diversity of wetlands in the Intermountain West. And so, you know, how do we better match that knowledge of what managers are facing on the ground versus what might be offered? And you know, sometimes managers don't necessarily even know what species they might want or need, and maybe need that advice too from suppliers. So I'm just curious if you have thoughts on that, either of you.
Yeah, we get a lot of questions about what plants work well in different parts of the Northwest here. And I always try to defer to more local knowledge because there's such great diversity, and climates, environments out there. The nursery can help to a certain degree, but really need to find experts that are really close to your area.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's see. So, a couple more questions here. I'm curious, going forward, we've identified a few things that maybe are emerging from this conversation today as well as from the presentation, but I'm curious, after hearing the presentation today and the discussion today, are there things that one you personally might choose to do differently going forward in your management or native plant supplying practices, and or one thing that just really strikes you as this next step, within this broader group would really help you in what you are doing? And I'll put this question out to everybody. Is there anything you might do differently based on what you heard today, or anything that it just has emerged or has risen to the top in terms of what could help you going forward? Does anybody want to address that?
Karen, can I just bring up one thing
Sure.
that just sparked for me is, and it was mentioned by others, there seems to be a lot of money in the system right now, and the risk there is kind of this feast or famine type business model. I know that on our end, we're already filling up for next year. I mean, we instantly were full for this year, and it's hard for us to build on capacity that quickly. So back to those contracts, if people can look far out and they have the flexibility to wait and get realistic timelines, I think that would help a lot of the producers. They would maybe have more appetite to take a risk on maybe expanding, but I think that's going to be a real challenge. We have a lot of money right now, and people want the materials, but we just can't produce them quickly enough.
Yeah.
And so that's something that will be a challenge over the next few years.
Okay, appreciate that. Let's see.
Jeff,
Rich,
Jeff, we've
Keith, you want to go, and then Rich?
yeah, Jeff, we've really pushed for ongoing funding for the work that we're doing for that reason. And we've had success in doing so, which is great. I mean, basically, we're just saying, any of this work that we're doing, it's not a one and done, it's ongoing. And if we don't have ongoing funding, we can't plan in advance, and we can't, be persistent, follow through where we need to. So that has worked well for us to get ongoing funding.
Yeah, that's very encouraging.
Maybe we're unique in that. I do have a thought regarding contracting. So I think for a lot of people, the challenge is that a lot of these agency government contracts, we can't pay until we receive a product, which is challenging for the business model of a nursery. But I'm wondering what people think about the idea of setting up contracts where we actually pay for the labor. So we can pay, we have contracts all the time for labor that we're paying someone to do a job for us, and I wonder if there's a way we could approach it where we're saying this contract is twofold, or maybe we can have two separate contracts. One is we're paying for you guys to grow plants for us. And then the second thing is we're buying plants from you. And maybe we'd have to connect the two, and we may need to get creative on what it looks like, like ongoing proof that the labor is happening. But that's just one workaround, I think, that I've had on my mind for a minute here.
Well, that would be helpful too, Keith. That is a good creative thought, because of course, normally all the suppliers want are just to cover their upfront hard costs, costs, and we don't even try to cover any of our labor. We're just trying to cover containers and soil and infrastructure and things like that. So thinking about it that way, I think, is a creative step if that can, break into a better contracting scenario.
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea and might, if this is a model that could be pursued in this particular instance, it could be a setup that then is shared with other folks working in agencies that face those same constraints, because, what's specific to Utah is actually probably a challenge many people face. Let's see, Rich, you wanted to chime in here.
Yeah, and I did a poor job of introducing myself before. Rich Hansen with Division of Wildlife Resources. I'm a wetland manager. I've been with the division for over 22 years. So, one thing that we kind of just thought of was in April and September every year, we kind of have a wetland managers field trip, and we collaborate and look at different areas. I think we're coming out here to Farmington Bay in a couple of weeks, but it's been good for the managers to collaborate, but this might be a great opportunity to get some vendors out on the ground with us to see what we're actually dealing with, and so we can meet them, interact, and maybe come up with create a relationship and come up with a game plan that way. Janice Garner coordinates it all, but I'll get a hold of her afterwards and just make sure it's okay. If there's anybody interested, maybe we could do that this year.
Yeah, I think that was definitely one thing that emerged from our conversations with people in the survey, was just the increasing those lines of communications between these user groups, so to speak. So I think that's a really nice idea. One of the challenges with the people that we surveyed, and thanks, Jeff. Yep, I know you got to run. Is that they are from throughout the Intermountain West. So when we were initially thinking about how to get back to the survey participants, we thought about trying to bring people down to Great Salt Lake from all of these survey participants, and we decided that was maybe too ambitious, but maybe at least folks from Idaho and a little bit closer in might be willing to do that or interested in doing that. So yeah, definitely appreciate that. Is there anything else from Chad or David there?
Yeah, just sticking on the topic of contracts. I'm still interested on how long of a contract are these vendors feel good about? Are we talking 2, 5 years? I mean, what are you guys hoping for, I guess, in the best case scenario?
Jim, is that something you could address from your perspective? Yeah, great.
Yeah. So if it's something we grow as a 1-year seedling, a 1.0, we'd probably need a 2-year contract. And if it's something we grow as a 2-year seedling, a 2.0, we probably need to have a contract signed about 3 years before delivery dates.
And what is your situation, Chad, in terms of ability to have contracts?
Well, I mean, we have a good ability to have contracts. It's just unlike Keith, we are asking for money on a yearly basis. That being said, we have good support, I would say, and we usually get most of our funding we ask for. But still, we do have to ask for it on a yearly basis. So I do have contracts that I don't have that are 5 years. And I don't have the 5 years worth of money, but basically they're set up to, hey, we're going to at least spend this minimum within that 5 years, but it could be up to this maximum. So there's some wiggle room there, but it's a little bit different than Keith's situation.
Yeah. Well, and you're not unique though, I think, in that respect. I think there's probably a lot of people who are just literally on an annual budget.
I just wanted to add to what Jim said from the survey itself, because I know a lot of vendors aren't able to be here, but that 2 to 3 year turnaround was a pretty common theme that arose. So that can kind of give an idea of that's pretty consistent.
Perfect.
Okay, so we're about out of time here. I just want to wrap up real quick and just say thanks again. Really appreciate everybody's participation today and the engagement in the survey. I think there have been some really important things that came out of both today and the broader effort. We will be following up, sharing the webinar recording with folks, as well as written products that have come. You know, there was a lot more detail from the surveys that we couldn't present on today, which, you know, you might actually find interesting to delve in a little bit more. And I want to encourage you to follow up with me if you have other thoughts on just going forward in terms of communication and collaboration. We will also try to share the list of vendors available from the region. And yep, thanks, Isaac. We will definitely do that. And yeah, thanks for joining us from wherever you are, including beautiful day out in the field on Great Salt Lake Wetlands. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.